Welcome back to Charlotte Doyle. We're going to begin part 1. Notice I said part 1, which leads us to believe there may be a part 2. So keep that in mind as we start part 1, chapter 1. Just before dusk in the late afternoon of June 16, 1832, I found myself walking along the crowded docks of Liverpool, England, following by the name of Grummidge. Though a business associate of my father, Mr. Grummidge was, like my father, a gentleman. It was he my father delegated to make the final arrangements for my passage to America. He was also to meet me when I came from school on the coach, then see me safely stowed aboard the ship that my father had previously selected. Mr. Grummidge was dressed in a black frock coat with a stovepipe hat that added to his considerable height. Now picture in your mind Abe Lincoln. That was a frock coat and a stovepipe hat that Abe Lincoln wore. His somber, sallow face registered no emotion. His eyes might have been those of a dead fish. "Miss Doyle," he said, as I stepped from the Liverpool coach. "Yes, sir. Are you Mr. Grummidge?" "I am." "I'm pleased to meet you," I said, dipping a curtsy. "Quite," he returned. "Now, Miss Doyle, if you would be so good as to indicate which is your trunk. I have a man here to carry it. Next, please oblige me by following, and everything shall be as it is meant to be." "Might I say good-bye to my chaperone?" "Is that necessary?" "Oh, she's been very kind." "Well, make haste then." In a flutter of nervousness, I identified my trunk. I threw my arms around Miss Emerson, my sweet companion for the trip down, and bid her a tearful farewell. Then I rushed after Mr. Grummidge, who had already begun to move on. A rough-looking porter, laboring behind, carried my trunk upon his back. No suitcases back then, so this was a large trunk. Our little parade reached dockside in good order. There I became instantly agog at the mass of ships that lay before us, masts and spars thick as the bristles on a brush. Everywhere I looked, I saw mountains of rare goods piled high, bales of hay and tobacco, chests of tea, a parrot, a monkey. Oh yes, the smell of the sea was intoxicating to one who knew little more than the smell of the trim-cut lawns and the fields of the Barrington School. Then, too, the surging crowds of workers, sailors, and merchants, all rough-hewn, brawny men, created an exotic late-afternoon hubbub. All in all was a most delicious chaos, which, while mildly menacing, was no less exciting because of that. Indeed, in some vague way, I had the feeling that it was all there for me. "Mr. Grummidge, sir," I called over the din, "what is the name of the ship I'm to sail on?" Mr. Grummidge paused briefly to look at me as though surprised I was there, to say nothing of asking a question. Then from one of his pockets he drew a scrap of paper. Squinting at it, he pronounced, "The Seahawk." "Is she British or American?" "American." "A merchant ship?" "To be sure." "How many masts?" "I don't know." "Will the other families already be on board?" "I should think so," he answered, exasperation in his voice. "For your information, Miss Doyle, I received word that departure was being put off, but when I checked with the captain directly, he informed me that there must have been some misunderstanding. The ship is scheduled to leave with the first tide tomorrow morning, so there can be no delay." To prove the point, he turned to move again. I, however, unable to quell my excited curiosity, managed to slip in one more question. "Mr. Grummidge, sir, what is the captain's name?" Mr. Grummidge stopped again, frowning in an irritable fashion, but all the same he consulted the paper. "Captain Jaggery," he announced, and once more he turned to go. "Here," the porter explained suddenly. He came close and overheard our talk. Both Mr. Grummidge and I looked about. "Did you say Captain Jaggery?" the porter demanded. "Are you addressing me?" Mr. Grummidge inquired, making it perfectly clear that if so, the porter had committed a serious breach of decorum. In other words, the workers were not to talk to someone who was rich. I was, the man said, talking over my head, and I'm asking if I heard right when you said we was going to a ship managed by a Captain Jaggery. He spoke the word Jaggery as if it were something positively loathsome. I was not addressing you, Mr. Grummidge, informed the man. But I heard you all the same, the porter went on, and so saying he swung my trunk down on the dock with such a ferocious crack that I feared it would snap in two. I don't intend to take one more step toward anything to do with Mr. Jaggery. Not for double gold, and not for one more step. See here, Mr. Grummidge cried with indignation, you undertook— Never mind what I undertook. It's worth more to me to avoid that man than to close with your coin. And without another word, he marched off. Stop, I said, stop, Mr. Grummidge called. It was in vain. The porter had gone, and quickly at that. Mr. Grummidge and I looked at each other. I hardly knew what to make of it, nor clearly did he. Yet he did what he had to do. He surveyed the area in search of a replacement. There, young man, he called to the first who passed by, a huge laboring fellow in a smock. Here's a shilling if you can carry this young lady's trunk. The man paused and looked at Mr. Grummidge and at me and at the trunk. That? He asked disdainfully. I'll be happy to add another shilling, I volunteered, thinking that a low offer was the problem. Miss Doyle, Mr. Grummidge snapped, let me handle this. 2 shillings, the workman said quickly. 1, Mr. Grummidge countered. 2, the workman repeated, and he held his hand out to Mr. Grummidge, who gave him 1 more coin. Then the man turned and extended his hand to me. Hastily I began to extract a coin from my reticule. Now, we don't use that word, reticule, but if she took a coin from her reticule, you might have guessed that it's a purse, and you would be right. Miss Doyle, Mr. Grummidge objected. Well, I did promise, I whispered, and I dropped the coin into the man's upturned palm. Right you are, miss, said the porter with the tip of his hat. May the whole world follow your fashion. This commendation of my principles of moral goodness brought a blush of pleasure that I could hardly suppress. As for Mr. Grummidge, he made a point of clearing his throat to indicate disapproval. Now then, the porter asked, where does this young lady require this? Never mind where, Mr. Grummidge snapped. Along the docks here. I'll tell you when we arrive. The money pocketed, the man lumbered over to my trunk, swung it to his shoulder in astonishing ease, considering the trunk's weight and size, and said, Lead on. Mr. Grummidge, wasting no more time, and perhaps fearful of the consequence of more talk, started off again. After guiding as though a maze of docks and quays, he came to a stop. With a half-turn he announced, There she sits, and gestured to a ship moored to the slip before us. I hardly looked where he pointed when I heard a thump. Startled, I turned and saw that the new man, the one we had just engaged, had taken one look at the Seahawk and sat down my trunk in haste and, like the first one, ran off without any word or explanation at all. Mr. Grummidge barely glanced over his shoulder at the hastily departing worker. In exasperation he said, Miss Doyle, you will wait for me here. And with rapid strikes he took himself up the gangplank and onto the Seahawk, where he disappeared from my view. I stood my place, more than ever wanting to get aboard and meet the delightful children who would be my traveling companions. But as I waited on the dock for something like half an hour, all but unmoving in the waning light of day, I could only gaze upon the ship. To say that I was unduly alarmed when I examined the Seahawk would be nonsense. I had not the remotest superstitious notion of what was to come. Nothing of the kind. I had seen before, or for that I had matter I have ever seen. Oh, perhaps she was smaller and older than I anticipated, but nothing else. Moored to the dock, she rode the swell easily. Her standard rigging, tarred black for protection against the salt sea, rose above me. dark ladders to an increasingly dark sky, and indeed, her royal yard seemed lost in the lowering night. Her sails, tied up that is, reefed, looked like sleeves of new-fallen snow on lofty trees. Briefly, the Seahawk was what is known as a brig, a two-masted ship with a snow mast behind the main, perhaps some 700 tons in weight, 107 feet stern to bow, and 130 feet deck to mainmast cap. She was built perhaps in the late 18th or early 19th century. Her hull was painted black, her bulwarks white, these being the ordinary colors. Her two masts, raked slightly back, were square-rigged. She had a bowsprit, too, one that stood out from her bow like a unicorn's horn. Indeed, the one unique aspect of this ship was a carved figurehead of a pale white Seahawk beneath the bowsprit. Its wings were thrust back against the bow, its head extended forward, beak wide open, red tongue protruding as if screaming. In the shadowy light that twisted and distorted its features, I was struck by the notion that this figure looked more like an angry, avenging angel than a docile bird. The dockside was deserted and growing darker. I felt like taking myself up the gangplank in search of Mr. Grummage. But alas, my good manners prevailed. I remained where I was, standing in a dreamlike state, thinking I know not what. But gradually, like a telescope being focused, I began to realize I was watching something clinging to one of the mooring ropes on the ship's stern. Pay particular attention to this part. It reminded me of a picture I once had seen of a sloth, an animal that hangs upside down upon jungle vines. But this, I gradually perceived, was a man. He appeared to be shimmying himself from the dock up to the Seahawk. Even as I realized what I was seeing, he boarded the ship and was gone. I had no time to absorb that vision before I heard angry voices. Turning, I saw Mr. Grummage appear at the top gallant rail, engaged in an argument with someone I could not see. My gentleman repeatedly looked down at me, and so I thought just gesticulated in my direction as if I were the subject of a heated discussion. At last Mr. Grummage came down to the dock. As he drew near, I saw that his face was flushed, with an angry eye that alarmed me. "Is something amiss?" I asked in a whisper. "Oh, not at all," he snapped. "All is as planned. You have been expected. The ship's cargo is loaded. The captain is ready to sail. But," he trailed off and looked back at the ship and then turned again to me. "Well, it's just that, you see, those two families, the ones you would be traveling with, your companions, they have not arrived." "But they will," I said, trying to compose myself. "That's not entirely certain," Mr. Grummage allowed. "The second mate informs me that one family sent word they could not reach Liverpool in time. The other family has a seriously ill child. There is concern that she should not be moved." Again, Mr. Grummage glanced over his shoulder at the Seahawk, as if, in some fashion, these events were the ship's fault. Turning back to me, he continued, "As it stands, Captain Jaggery will accept no delay of departure. Quite proper. He has his orders." "But Mr. Grummage, sir," I asked in dismay. "What shall I do?" "Do, Miss Doyle? Your father left orders that you were to travel on this ship at this time. I'm very specific written orders in that regard. He left no money to arrange otherwise. As for myself, I'm off for Scotland tonight on pressing business." "But surely," I cried, frustrated by the way Mr. Grummage was talking as much as by his news, "surely I mustn't travel alone." "Miss Doyle," he returned, "being upon a ship with a full complement of captain and crew could hardly be construed as traveling alone." But that would be all men, Mr. Grummage, and I'm a girl. It'd be wrong." I cried in absolute confidence that I was echoing the beliefs of my beloved parents. Mr. Grummage drew himself up. "Miss Doyle," he said loftily, In my world, judgments as to rights and wrongs are left to my Creator, not to children. Now be so good as to board the Seahawk at once.